Thanks, Duncan. Today, we start a new series in the book of Daniel. We are going to be examining what is in this book with these strange tales of a land long ago. However, one of the keys that we're going to see is that I actually think this book has a huge amount to say to us about how we live today. Which is why we have this clever little picture here that looks like it's old, except it has the Edinburgh skyline in the front of it. And what we're pointing out is that actually, as we live today, we experience the world just as Daniel did. This is not working, is it? Nope, we're not working here. So, what's in this story? It's not just lions and fires. If I asked you about what is in Daniel, what would you tell me? I'm pretty sure quite quickly we would get to Daniel in the lion's den. We would get to the people in the fire. What else might we get to? What else is in the book of Daniel? Anyone remember anything about the book of Daniel at all? Sorry, weird visions. Yeah, we'll get to those. Weird writing on the wall, prayers being answered. The statue, yeah, in the vision, yeah. Pardon? Stumps, yes. Wild animals, there's a few other bits and pieces there. Fasting. It is not teaching the benefits of vegetarianism, Nick. Not even a little bit. But the key question I have for us is, how do all those bits hang together, right? We've got a lion's den. We've got a king Nebuchadnezzar. We've got a Daniel who is able to interpret visions. We've got other kings that appear. We've got people in fiery furnaces who don't get burned up, some who do get burned up, and then we have another king, King Cyrus, at the end. How does it all hang together? That's what I want us to have a quick look at this morning. I want to give us a broad brush of how this book holds together, so that as we go through this we're going to do 6 weeks just now, and then we'll take a pause during the Lent season where we're doing another series, and then we'll do the other 6 chapters afterwards. But this is the structure. There are 2 options for how we structure or understand the book of Daniel. The first is the one we're going to follow, and I'll just briefly outline that. Basically, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are stories about Daniel and his friends that we just read about, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then the second 6 chapters are about Daniel's visions, 7 through 12, the visions that he has. And that's the format that we are going to follow. However, I want to suggest that option 2 is actually probably more faithful to the actual structure of the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel is peculiar in the Bible in that it's written in 2 different languages. It's written in Hebrew, the language of the Jewish people, and it's written in Aramaic, which would have been the kind of international language, the wider language of the ancient Near East. And so chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. We get the one that Duncan's just read so well for us. Good job, you got all the pronunciations. I mean, we're going to say right, but nobody really knows, so don't worry about it. It's written in Hebrew, and it tells us something of the history of what is going on in this book. Chapters 2 through 7 are historical narratives, and they're written in Aramaic, the language of Babylon in many ways. And then chapters 8 through 12, the prophecies of Daniel, are once again written in Hebrew. And so I think the book itself points us to this kind of structure on the side. So we'll bear that in mind as we go through, because it will probably help us, particularly as we get into the second part of it, some of the trickier structures. For those of you who are interested more in this, the Bible Project, which I hope most of you know about, but if you don't, you should know about it. TheBibleProject.com is a website that does some of the best Bible teaching available. You could go to Bible college and spend tens of thousands of pounds getting an education, and it wouldn't be as good as spending 5 minutes a day watching one of these videos. So basically, they've got loads of different ones, thematic ones, but they have a video on each book of the Bible that outlines the narrative structure and all the stuff that goes on in the Bible. I would highly recommend watching the one on Daniel. Like I said, we're not following the same structure because it just works better from a preaching point of view to use the one that we are. But the option 2 will be well outlined by them in that video. So if you're on our church email list, we'll put that out this week, a link to that. If you're not on our church email list, why not? Go to our website, pbc.scot/sign up, give us your email address, and then every week you can get what's going on, and that will be there next week. So that's the kind of structure of what goes on. And we're going to follow, as I say, that first section, chapters 1 to 6, story about Daniel and his friends. Well, this is just not working. Okay. Next slide, Archie. Please. The background, what's going on? So I think it's helpful for us to remember and understand this context that this is taking place in. So the book itself, Daniel, in the Christian Bible is located among the prophets. So if you're looking for it in your Bible, it's quite near the back, page 1200, quite near the back of the Old Testament. It has Ezekiel before it and Hosea immediately after it. It's in the middle of the prophets there. However, in the Jewish scriptures, which have largely the same books, they just organize them differently, they put it in the wisdom literature, which is really interesting. So it's in with Proverbs and the like. Daniel, as a book itself, has prophecy, it has history, and it has some apocalyptic writing that we'll see as we go through. In terms of the events that take place, chronologically, they happen at the end of the book of Kings, basically. So we're around 605 BC, so 600 years or so before Jesus. And in the context of the wider story, having been led out of Egypt under Moses, God's people enter the promised land of Canaan under Joshua. Initially, they had judges that led them, but they wanted a king, and they continually turned away from God. God eventually relents and accepts the request for a king, beginning with Saul, and then you get David and his son Solomon. And then sadly, things deteriorate and the kingdom splits in two. We get the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south, and the remaining tribes, the other 10, are in the north. Each kingdom has a succession of kings of varying faithfulness to God until the northern kingdom is conquered by Assyria and they're carried off into exile. That's about 722 BC. And after this, the southern kingdom gets conquered by Babylon, and that's in the early 6th century BC, as I just said. And this is where we pick up the story of Daniel. What happens here, next slide please, Archie, is right at the beginning of the story, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar comes, he besieges Jerusalem. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with articles from the temple, so he carries those off. And then most importantly, they carry off into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobles. And that's the context of the beginning of Daniel. And really what I want us to focus most of our time this morning on is this idea of exile. What happens here is that the elite, if you like, or the elite to be, likely Daniel and his friends were early teenagers at this point, and they're carried off to this far foreign land, Babylon. Babylon being modern-day Iraq, Iran, around that sort of an area. And the intent of this is really to destroy the Jewish culture. Because if you remove all of those who have power, all of those who are the ones who are going to carry on that story, you take them somewhere else and you enculturate them with your story, then actually you destroy the culture that you came from. It is in some ways an act of genocide. And the goal is to take these young men and essentially put them to the University of Babylon, to their highest echelons. They're going to give them an MBA. They're going to get their PhD in Babylonian workings and the Babylonian story. And then they will be put to use. The idea is to destroy the culture of these people that they're carrying off into exile. And so among them are Daniel and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It's important to note they're not the only four who carried off, as there's lots of them at this point. And this is the first of three invasions by Nebuchadnezzar to Jerusalem. The second one will take place 8 years later, in 597 BC, and then the final one in 587 BC, when everyone that remained in Babylon was brought to Babylon and the temple was destroyed. That's what happens over the course of those basically 20 years. We know that this was prophesied by Habakkuk. Habakkuk, probably about 10 years prior to the first invasion by Babylon, his whole book is this prophecy that God is going to raise up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to come and to destroy the temple because the Jews have not been faithful to what God had called them to. And so then we follow these stories of Daniel and his friends, and we discover two things. One is that they have an opportunity. They have the opportunity to bring justice and shalom of God to this new land while making good lives for themselves. In fact, Jeremiah is going to write a letter to all of those people carried off into exile. And he is going to say that they are to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city into which I have called you. Jeremiah chapter 29. But alongside that opportunity to be a blessing, there is a deep challenge. And that challenge is assimilation. To so give up on their Hebrew faith, to be indistinguishable from the people of Babylon. To be so enculturated by the story of Babylon that they lose their own sense of identity and who they actually are. This is the key story of Daniel. It's not about fires and lions or visions and dreams. It really is about the question of how do you live faithfully when you are in exile? And you might think, well, that doesn't apply to us. I mean, I can think of some people in the world to whom it applies, but it doesn't apply to us. I'm not sure that's true. I think we are very much a people in exile. The New Testament talks about that. Next slide, please, Archie. 1 Peter says this, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." The New Testament identifies us as people of exile. Exile from where? I'm not exiled from anywhere. The little clip I played from Reframe had Rick Watts saying, I'm convinced that it's because we don't understand what it is to belong to the kingdom of God. And actually, this is the exile that we have. We are exiled from our true home, from being with God. And so we experience life in the world as exiles. We experience the living in a land with a different set of values. One that requires all of us without any care for our own true values. And our challenge is exactly the same as that which will be faced by Daniel and his friends, to avoid assimilation into the values of the world and the story of the world. While our opportunity is also identical, it's to bring something of the justice and the shalom of God to the world while carving out the good life, whatever the good life might be, and we may talk some about that. The good news is it doesn't involve vegetarianism. The book of Daniel is not a collection of old otherworldly stories. They're stories about us. And they're prophecies about how it is that God is in control when nothing seems to be going right. This will be our key focus for the next, the 12 weeks of this series. How do we live faithfully in exile? And I want to make two caveats at the beginning that will likely come up, but I need you to remember these. The first is that this is not some weird dualism that we're setting up. This is not some strange us versus the world or God versus the devil as some sort of equal battle to figure out who gets to win. That's not the way the Bible's written. It's not a dualism. It is about asking the question of what it is to live faithfully in the midst of all that's going on, to live faithfully for Jesus. That's the challenge. It's not about some strange, that's out there, so we should run away from all of this. No. There are church traditions that have forever tried to say the world's over there and we're over here, and they either become weird cults or they become irrelevant. Neither of which is what we want. The challenge is to live in that middle point, in the tension of it, and to wrestle with it. It's one of the reasons I don't think you can live faithfully as a Christian without the church, because we need one another for this. So that's the first one. It's not a weird dualism. The second is this. The pain is not a punishment for us. This matters. The word exile in the Old Testament relates entirely to judgment. Okay? The exile of the people of God from their land was a judgment. The Bible's very clear on that. We could look at any number of the prophets and see that they prophesied both to the northern kingdoms that were carried off by Assyria and to Judah that this was going to happen in Babylon. The exile was a punishment from God for disobedience. When we experience pain and challenge in our lives, it is not a punishment from God. God may use it to discipline us. God may use it to form us and to shape us, but it is not a punishment from God. Our experience of exile is not a punishment from God. Does that make sense? I don't want anyone to hear it like that as we go through these passages over the course of the next 12 weeks. The exile of Israel was the judgment of God. Our pain and suffering as we go through this is not the judgment of God. It's the only way that the language of exile doesn't work when we talk about us. Because Jesus has won. He has brought us back to the Father. At some level, we are not exiled from our Father in heaven, except at another level we are. It's the whole kingdom now and not yet moment. Does that make sense? Yeah. Good. Remember those two things. Okay. So how does that play out in our text today? I'm not just beginning my sermon, by the way. This wasn't just a very long introduction. I have 3 very short points that we're going to run through here that I want to look at the text that Duncan read for us and ask this question of, if this is in exile, how does the things that happen in this text play out in our lives? Excuse me. So our names are changed. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah, Yah, as in Yahweh, has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, Yah has helped, right? These are all names that speak of the faithfulness and the goodness of God. They are then given names from Babylon. Belteshazzar, Bel will protect. Now, Bel's awesome, but I really don't want to trust that that's the case. Bel was one of the gods of the Babylonians. Shadrach means inspired of Aku, another Babylonian god. Meshach, belonging to Aku. Abednego, servant of Nego, another Babylonian deity, idol. Do you see what's happened here? These names that were given to them, their real, true identity is then taken away, and the Babylonians give them a new name that says, that which you believed before is now no longer true, and actually we are going to identify who you are. It's an attempt to destroy their true identity. It strips them of their story, of where they belong. It tells them that they are something else. And friends, this happens to us today all the time. All the time. The most extreme example, you get put in prison, you literally no longer have a name, you have a number. This is from the British government's website. You can contact a prisoner by writing to them. Write the person's prisoner number on the envelope. Their name is stripped from them, their identity is stripped from them, and they're given a number. That's who they are. And we understand, but that's prisoners. They've done awful things, they deserve that. No, they don't. But for us, the same thing happens. It's just a bit more subtle. We're understood, our value is understood as what we can produce so that somebody else can get wealthy out there. Our value is so that we can consume so that somebody else can get wealthy out there. September the 11th, it's a very famous story, but September the 11th happens. It's an awful moment. George Bush goes on TV, and what's the thing he tells the Americans to do? He tells them to go shopping. Go buy something. Because they needed to keep the economy going. The world tells us a story that our value is found in stuff we can consume or stuff we can produce for others. We get reduced to a number or a reference. I've been trying to organize to pay my electricity bill since I moved into my new house. You would have thought that would be an easy thing to do. But somebody somewhere registered our address all wrong, and so they don't have it. And I said to the woman, "Oh, that's great. That means I don't need to pay then, eh?" She didn't have a sense of humor. It would be fair to say that she indicated that very much I had to pay my electricity bill or else I would no longer have electricity. But she wouldn't talk to me until I could tell her what my reference number was. I was like, "I don't have a reference number." She's like, "Well, I can't help you." I'm like, but I've been told you give me my electricity. She's like, "What's your address?" I told her, "We don't give you your electricity. I'm telling you, you give my electricity." Until I had that little 15-digit number, she wouldn't speak to me, couldn't help me. Until we spoke to her supervisor, who miraculously somehow could find it. In so many ways, we get reduced to numbers or to a story that isn't who we actually are, just like Daniel and Belteshazzar. So who gets to name you? Well, at some level, your parents name you, right? They pick your name and you have literally no say in it, and you just hope that they're not daft. And if Karen was here, I would have her come up at this point. Karen spent a while when she was training as a doctor working in Glasgow in the maternity unit, and has some belter stories of some of the names that were chosen for children. You might want to ask her about that over coffee later. There are some really, really amusing ones. But our parents name us. But the Bible also talks about God naming us. Because in every way that the world would seek to name us in a way that allows them to define who we are, so too does God. And we can think of some examples, right? We know that Peter had his name changed by Jesus, for example. He was Simon, he's now Peter. And there's a whole bunch of examples of that where people get new names. But there's this beautiful little verse in Revelation chapter 2 that I want to read to you. This is in the letters to the churches, in other words, known as the bit of Revelation that people preach on because they understand what's happening there when they ignore the rest of it. We get the letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And in the letter to the church at Pergamum, it finishes with this. These are Jesus' words. "To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna." There's a sermon in that, but we don't have time for that today. "I will also give the person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. There's something beautiful here, friends. God, the one who put the stars in space, the one who made everything that you know, who put together molecules and atoms and like things smaller than that I don't understand. The one who did that has a name for you, and it's really a little private name between you and him. That's what that tells us. That's the level of intimacy with which God loves you and by which he wants to define who you are. Not the world's name for you, 15-digit number, or, and listen, we're guilty of this because we meet people and we go, oh, what do you do? And you're like, first question, what do you do? Oh, now I've defined you, put in a box, right? You meet people and they go, I have a job like this. I don't know what box to put you in now. But people meet me. We went to a dinner party where we knew almost nobody a few years ago, before COVID. We sat down, sat to the person next to me, blah, blah, blah. First question they asked me is, what do you do? Yeah, I'm a minister. All right. And the person kind of turns this way and says to the person, what do you do? And then I saw the back of that person for most of the rest of the night. Because they put me in a box, right? I'm the minister. I'm therefore boring and dull and not to be talked to at a dinner party. They might not be wrong. God has a name for you, friends. Find out that name. Live under that story. Live under that calling, not what the world would call you to be. And I think that's what Daniel and his friends managed to do. They managed to live under the story that came from Judah, not the story that they were told by Babylon. And how does that work out here? Well, we see them. They're told that they're going to have to eat this food, and we get this strange becoming of vegetarians. Why is that? Is it because vegetarianism is good? Let's hear it, Nick. No! Yes. What is going on? Is it that eating vegetables is healthier for you? It's not that at all. I think there are two things that are going on here. You'll be pleased to hear that when I read the commentary this week, he suggested 8 reasons. I'm only giving you 2 because I think they're the 2 more important ones. The first is that it's food sacrifice to idols is most likely what's being offered to them. So it would have been offered to the idols, and then it would have come to the king's kitchen and then been fed to everyone from there. So the food at the king's table had already been offered to the idols. And so the first reason they reject it is because they want to keep themselves pure. There's a sense of purity that they're committing to. And we'll see that through the rest of the stories. This is one of the reasons. They weren't offered burgers and Coke drinks, but that was the best image I could find today. So the other, though, is back and related to the story of what defines us. And I found this to be the most compelling of the arguments, because there's lots of reasons why the food sacrifice to idols might actually not be a massive problem for them. But the food that they were being given was unfamiliar. It was Babylonian food, or as my dad would say, foreign food. I didn't grow up in a house where we ate a lot of foreign food. Pizza was about as foreign as we got. And that was just the way we grew up. We were a meat and 2 veg house. And as my mum would say, it didn't do you any harm. So she's absolutely right. But foods tell part of our story, don't they? The kind of food that we eat tells part of our story. If you've ever lived overseas, you tend to gather together with those who are quite like you, and when you gather together, you'll eat foods from the places that you came from. That's true, that's what happens. It's amazing how many Scottish people overseas long for haggis. They never eat it when they're here, but they long for haggis. When we lived in Vancouver, there was actually a Scottish shop about 10 miles outside Vancouver. And we would drive there, and we would always come home with Iron Brew. I never drink Iron Brew. This stuff's foul. But when you're 8,000 miles from home, Iron Brew is like the nectar of the gods. I mean, where else can you get such sugary nonsense? And the fact that haggis was banned in America just made it even more like, we must have this. We've been denied our birthright. It was ridiculous. One commentator says this: more generally, what we eat and drink, like what we wear and how we speak, commonly constitute an outward expression of our self-identity and commitments. Let me say that again. What we eat and drink, like what we wear and how we speak, commonly constitute an outward expression of our self-identity and commitments. This is just like the names. Daniel has no call over what people are going to call him, but he does have a say over what he will eat. And I think that's the main reason they make this choice. And they say, listen, we're going to trust in God in the midst of this. Give us the vegetables and it won't kill us. We won't end up withering away. And by a miracle of God, that was true. It's about identity. Last point, and with this we're going to finish. Right at the very end of our reading this morning, we read these words. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Little throwaway. But do you remember what I said when I was telling you about the kind of all the boring background stuff? He was carried off around 605 BC, and that the exile of God's people was ended by King Cyrus when he sends them back. And we read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah. That's 70 years later. So the reality is Daniel lived the full extent of the exile, the whole exile. He lived in service of the king in Babylon. There was no escape for him. He wasn't just being good until he could get a moment where he was well enough trusted that he could grab a horse and go galloping back across the desert and go all the way back to Judah. He settled in and learned to live in the midst of this hostile environment while retaining his faith. We're going to see lots of examples throughout that. There's one brilliant one where it says he turns and he prays, and it says he prayed at the time of the offering of the offering of the sacrifices. And by this point, the temple's gone. And you're like, how did he know that? Actually, because he had so built into himself the story of Israel and the practices of the Jewish people that he could live like that in the midst of an environment that was actually at that point telling him he wasn't allowed to pray. We'll see that in a few weeks' time. But he wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to live faithfully. And friends, for us, that's the same. Our goal in this world is not to somehow escape this terrible world, but rather to live faithfully in the midst of it. To live well for Jesus in the midst of the challenging environment that we find ourselves in. It's not about running away. It's not about planning for an escape. It's not about actually saying, well, one day this will all be better and they will do all the things we want them to do. No. It's also not about going, well, it's fine. It's all going to burn up one day anyway, and I'll go and sit in a cloud with my harp and it'll be cool. No. No, the Bible's clear. This is about recreation, and we get to participate in God's process of redemption now. This is good news, friends. It's really good news, because this book, talking about something that happened 2,500 years ago, is about how you and I live today for Jesus. And I find that quite encouraging. That there's hope, that we can live in the midst of very difficult times. And friends, it's hard. It is hard to live for Jesus today. And depending on what job you have, that can be harder than in other places. Depending on if you've got young children or you've got teenagers just now, it's hard to bring them up in the midst of this world. It is difficult. But this gives us hope. We can do this. And above all, the thing that we're going to see that sits underneath all of this, God is faithful. And it's that we have faith in, not in our ability to be clever enough like Daniel, or wise enough like Daniel, or have special spiritual gifts like Daniel. Those are all important. But his biggest thing he had, and the thing that we need, is to be able to trust that God is good. And he is faithful and worthy of our trust and faithfulness in the midst of these difficult times. So here's the questions. Who will define you? Who gets to define you? You choose. Will we trust that God is in control even when we can't see it? Will we trust that God is good even when we're living in exile? And will we begin to learn over and over that we belong to God and to the kingdom of heaven? And as Paul says, that our citizenship really is in heaven. Will you stand with me? Father, we stand before you, recognizing that you know us. You know our lives. You know all the challenges we face. You know the things we find difficult, the things that we are struggling with. You know the pressures that are pushing down on us. And you don't just know that in a generic sense, but you know each and every one of us. You know the places where people are trying to call us by other names. And you want to speak your name for us, to us. Give us ears to hear you speaking to us just now. I want you just to take a moment and hold before God your life, your circumstances, the pressures you feel, the places where you feel like you're being named by someone else, that they're trying to take that identity from you. And I want you to say to God, God, show me how to live here. How can I be faithful in my experience of exile? Those things to us. Will you help us to see your goodness, your faithfulness, your love, your compassion, your care for us? And help us in this time of worship to root our faith not in the things we can do, but in your goodness, in your faithfulness. That we would choose to be defined as followers of the God who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ, the one full of grace and truth.